Let's go. Benjamin Orr and the Cars. Welcome, Joe Milliken.
It's great to be here, Joe. It's good to finally meet you in person, too.
It is. How was the drive?
The drive was fine. No problems at all. Happy to be here, coming down from southern Vermont into the big city.
Who's going to drive you home?
Ha ha, boom boom.
Bad. Did you listen to Drive All the Way Down? Okay, I won't go there. Forward by David Spiro. So tell us about this David Spiro.
David Spiro, wonderful gentleman. Benjamin Orr is originally from Cleveland, home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which was actually one of the reasons I wanted to write about Ben. I thought it was really interesting that his hometown was the home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But David, big name in Cleveland. He was a radio DJ in the 80s in the biggest FM rock station in Cleveland, WMMS. He has managed Joe Walsh. He currently is the manager of Bad Company, one of the biggest rock bands in the world. But his father, Herman Spiro, was the executive producer of a TV show in Cleveland. It was a music television show called Upbeat. And it was sort of the Cleveland version of American Bandstand, if you will, where they would bring in national artists to sing their current hits. And the thing that made Upbeat different from American Bandstand is they would have house bands play in the background. So when they would go to a commercial or whatever, they'd have house bands playing music. And what Herman Spiro would do is he would go into Cleveland and find the hot rock bands in the city. And they would bring those bands in to be house bands. And Benjamin Orr, as a 17-year-old up-and-coming musician, was in a band called the Grasshoppers. And the Grasshoppers were the house band on that Upbeat show for a period of time. And of course, David Spiro used to go to work with his dad. So he was a 12-year-old kid, and he would hold up cue cards, and he would hand out checks to the musicians and the workers at the end of the week. And he got to know Ben, so he knew Ben his whole life. And of course, like I just said, he ended up being a radio DJ and a prominent music manager, managing different bands. The Michael Stanley Band is another Cleveland band that he was a manager of.
So
he's known Benjamin all his life. And I thought he would be perfect to write the foreword for the book. And of course, he's interviewed in the book too. Gave me some great stories about Benjamin. And when the book came out, when I did my Boston book event, David came and he was kind enough to fly in and be the moderator for my book event. So I got to sit down, just like we are, and talk about the book. So David's been wonderful to me, and he's a great guy.
Facebook Live it or any kind of taping of the event?
Yeah, we got some video footage of him and I talking on stage during the event. And I have a Facebook page for the book, and there's some video clips on there. And I also have a website for the book that has a page of,
What's the website name?
It's real simple. It's www.benorbook.com. So people can go there and check it out. There's photos, anecdotes, quotes, a couple of video clips, just a little more information about the book. So,
Two pertinent questions. Did Upbeat videotape keep the footage of the shows?
I know that they have an archive, and I have seen specific YouTube clips of a specific artist doing a song. So I would imagine that they have full shows somewhere in their archive. But there is video footage of the show. I think it started in the late 50s and went to the early 70s. And at one point, it was nationally syndicated in like 80 cities across the country. So not quite as big as American Bandstand, but pretty close.
Well, the reason I'm bringing it up is one of the Cars' major influences was the Velvet Underground.
That's true.
They performed Run, Run, Run on Upbeat.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
My guitarist, Fred Pinot, God bless him, he knows these things. He said they did Run, 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 and I remembered 40 years later after Fred told me, because I'm such a diehard Lou Reed fan. But I was Ben's personal videographer in his solo band with John Kalishis.
We talked about that briefly. It was a long time ago. Because, you know, I'd like to also add that you're quoted in this book.
Thank you very much.
And,
yes.
Yeah, so it was great. We talked a little bit about it. I thought it was really interesting that that you knew so much about the band and you remember the Captain Swing days. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Well, Come Back Down is if she ever here she comes now. No, if she ever comes back down. Well, see, I'm confused now because of the two songs. The Velvet Underground had If She Ever Come Now, Now, If She Ever Come Now, Now, and they just completely took it.
Ah.
So it never came out. But you can see it up on YouTube. Someone put it up on YouTube, but it was a complete copy of the Velvet Underground.
Yeah, Rick was a big Velvet Underground fan.
Well, Rick was big at, you know what the opening to Just What I Needed is, right?
The opening to Just What I Needed. I'm
Yummy,
not sure.
Yummy, Yummy by the 1910 Fruit Gum Company.
I didn't know that.
Wait, when you go home and play it on YouTube, I'll play it for you on YouTube here after the show. The intro to Just What I Needed is the intro to Yummy, Yummy, Yummy. John Macy told me that because John Macy had record companies at Paul's Mall coming to see Fox Pass. And he had the cars, his friends, the cars open. And the cars got the attention. So...
Yeah, there were a lot of bands playing at the Rat at that time, too, and the Cars were really the first to get a big record deal and get a lot of attention.
I was at their first show. So it was at the Rat, and it must have been around February or March because I had a big stick with me, and I'm walking down the stairs with the stick. Scott Barronwall, do you know him?
Yep.
Robin Lane and the Chartbusters, but he was in the Archies.
He's quoted in the book.
He was in the Archies. Mm-hmm. You know that.
Yep, and you told me this story way back when. I'm kind of getting a flashback because it was several years ago that you and I interviewed for the book, and you told me all kinds of stories. And as you're saying these things, I'm going, oh, yeah, I remember him telling me about that.
I like this big stick I found. So I'm walking around with the stick. It's like a cane, but it's a stick, right? And Scott Barronwall goes, the promise of spring. And that was what he said to me going down to see the Cars because Suki Jones from Back in the Saddle Again, Aerosmith, she was dating the drummer, David Robinson.
Yep.
So I'm up at David's house, and David, this is what David Robinson would do for me. These are great car stories. It's midnight. We went to the Rat. Now we're hanging out with David, and he knew that I liked Dark Shadows, which was on at midnight. He goes into his room, gets the TV, and sets it up for me so I can watch Dark Shadows. Such a gentleman.
That's funny.
David's a great guy.
He really is. He's 2 of the 4 surviving members of the Cars interviewed for the book, and
Greg
Hawkes
Greg's
being the
awesome.
other. Oh, they're both
You have something in common
wonderful
with
gentlemen.
Greg.
Something in common with Greg?
He's been on this show twice.
Has he really?
Oh yeah. He did my 7th or 8th show. He was a gentleman.
Oh, he's a great guy.
Yeah, we great interview with Greg. I mean, and then we got him at some convention down in Connecticut. You know, one of Charles Rosenay's conventions, I think it was. So I could talk to you for 3 hours about all this fun stuff. So I'm going to get back to you, but I do want to say, I would be at the Cars shows at the Rat. And the first car show was great because there was only 8 people in the audience.
There's a photo in the book from that first show.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow, I did not see that.
Photographer Robert Post, who's a Boston photographer.
Well,
he used to go to the Rat and shoot photos, and he was kind enough to provide me a photo. So that first show you were at, there's a photo of Ben in the book.
David's girlfriend worked for my father, so I had the company van. I was the vice president. I got the van. And she came with me. She was dating David, so we went down to the Rat together, and that was the first show. And it was post-Captain Swing. But you know how Rick and the Rabbits were named?
Richard and the Rabbits.
Richard and the Rabbits.
Yeah, that was...
The Modern Lovers, David's drummer. David drummed for Jonathan Richman.
Jonathan Richman, that was the name. I was trying to remember.
And but David wasn't with Richard and the Rabbits, right?
No, he was not. He joined afterward. But another gentleman who was in Richard and the Rabbits, their guitar player before Elliot Easton came along, Fusby Morris, was their original guitar player, and he is interviewed in the book. The name you mentioned before, John Macy, he's interviewed in the book.
Oh, good, good.
There's a lot of people in there. I interviewed Over 120 people. Because, unfortunately, Ben passed away some 20 years ago now. So obviously
I can't believe it's 20 years.
Yeah, 2000, he passed away.
Oh my God.
So obviously I didn't have the opportunity to interview the gentleman myself. So what's the next best thing? You find as many people as you can who did know him so they could be his voice. So that's what I did. And sometimes people will ask me, well, how did you find all these people? And I started with an original list of maybe a dozen names of people that I could interview. And every person I talked to, they would say, well, who else have you talked to? Have you talked to so-and-so? And I go, no, I haven't talked to, you haven't talked to so-and-so? Oh, you got to talk to them. They loved Ben. They know Ben. Here's his number. So I'd interview that person, and they would go, so have you talked to so-and-so? No, I haven't. You haven't? So it just kept going, and everybody I talked to would give me another name and another name. And something that I realized during this process, you just have no idea how many people a rock star knows. Because to be honest with you, I had to cut it off after a while. I could still be interviewing people. I've had people contact me after the book comes out and say, how come you didn't interview me? I knew Ben. I would have talked to you. I'm like, well, and I tell them that story. It's like, if someone didn't tell me about you, how am I going to find you? And I could have done interviews forever.
Well, Ben was very forthcoming and very warm to his fans, much like Brad Delp was. So after a Beetlejuice show, Brad Delp would sign autographs. Mm-hmm. And the last time I saw Brad, he pointed at me and goes, Joe, wait for me. So, okay, so he's handing out autographs, and JoJo Lane had passed away, Denny Lane's ex-wife. Mm-hmm. She was one of my closest friends in the world. And I forwarded an email. I sent an email to his manager, and who forwarded it to Brad. And Brad said to me, I didn't know. They used to sing Beatles songs together when they were in high school, JoJo and Brad, because they were both from Danvers area, mm-hmm. up there. So, I'm with Brad. It must have been February of that year. And then, like 2-3 weeks later, I'm at the IBS convention, which is like next week. It's 80 years old now. It's the oldest college radio convention in the country, in the world.
Wow.
And one of the principals comes out, and he says to me, did you know Brad Delp? I go, did I know Brad Delp? I mean, I was just with him 3 weeks ago. He goes, he's dead. So that's how I learned of it. I'm at this radio convention, and Norm came out and said to me, did you know Brad Delp? Of course I know Brad. But past tense, it was very, very odd. So these are he was, like Ben, one of the nicest people. And so I thank you for documenting, because no one is going to be able to cover the Cars the way you did. This is so thorough. It is amazing. And the work you put into this is not just a Ben Orr book. It's a Cars book, but it really shows that Ben was part of the Lennon-McCartney team. Yeah. He not always got the credit that Rick got, because Rick was very good at promoting himself.
And he was the main songwriter, too. He was kind of naturally the leader of the band. And the big, tall, lanky guy, kind of stood out. And, deservedly so, Rick being the leader. I mean, he was the main songwriter. Ben's not going to sing Drive if Rick doesn't write it. And Ben's not going to sing Let's Go if Rick doesn't write it. So there's some Ben fans out there that I don't want to say they're mad or bitter about it, but they come to me and say, we're so glad you did this book because Ben doesn't get enough attention. It's all Rick, all Rick, all Rick. And I'm not going to go as far as to say that I would defend Rick, but I would say to them, Rick was pretty important to that band. Like I just said, if he doesn't write these hit songs, what's Ben going to sing, right? So I think, Rick deserves to be the leader of the band, if you will. But that doesn't take anything away from Ben.
No, I think Ben liked having a leader.
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Because
less pressure for him.
And as good as Ben, as you just mentioned, as good as Ben was to the fans, and very appreciative of them, Ben, and you look at him, though, and you're like, look at the rock star, the good-looking rock star. But he didn't seek the spotlight per se. I describe it as, in some of my other interviews, Ben would flip a switch to go on stage and be a rock star and dress to the nines and swoon all the girls. One of the greatest rock voices of all time, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not just saying that because I wrote the book. I mean, to me, he's right up there with David Bowie, Paul McCartney, Paul Rodgers of Bad Company. I mean, Ben's just an incredible, iconic rock and roll voice. And sometimes he doesn't get enough credit as a musician. I mean, I know he wasn't a virtuoso bass player, so to speak, but he knew how to sit in the pocket, and he knew what Cars songs needed. He didn't need to go all over the place. He knew what the songs needed. And him and David Robinson, I think, were... And David Robinson, too, he's not necessarily a virtuoso player. He had a very simple kit. But those two sat in the pocket together, and they knew exactly what Cars songs needed, and they did it to a T.
Do you want to hear a story about Ben that Ben never heard?
That Ben never heard. Shoot.
So Ben dated a friend of mine briefly, a woman, and she comes over the house with another dear friend of mine who was a writer for the Boston Globe and a singer in my band, okay? So the two women are on the couch at my house, and so I put on the Cars. She was like, play some Ben. She dated Ben. So I play some Cars I taped from the rack, like on a cassette, and I got it playing, and she's swooning, and then I put on some video that we can't play on this show. And now she's watching the video, hearing it, and she's going, Ben, oh, Ben. It was great.
That's funny.
And it was just in the middle of the afternoon with these two women. And Liz, the girl in my band, she just loved it because they were good friends, and she just thought it was hysterical. It was just like, this girl who dated Ben briefly, and they loved him. They loved him. They couldn't let go of him.
Yeah. There's a lot of common threads with the people I interviewed. And they're not going to say bad things about Ben when I'm interviewing him about the book.
That wasn't a bad thing, was it?
No, not at all. Not at all. But
It shows the devotion.
Yeah. Yeah. And it shows how much people loved him.
He loved him. I mean, she was kidding, of course, but she was really, she loved Ben.
Ben was a standoffish kind of guy, and like I was mentioning before, he didn't necessarily seek the spotlight, but he was more an observer. He would watch somebody and get to know them and see what kind of person they were. But all these people tell me that it might take a while for Ben to warm up to you, but if he decided that you were going to be his friend, you were his friend for life, and he would do anything for you. He was a very loyal guy. I interviewed people that went to junior high school with him. That's how far back some of my interviews go. And those people say the same types of things that people I interviewed before he passed. So whether he was 16 years old in junior high or 50 years old just a few years before he passed, these people said the same things about him. Very loyal guy, give you the shirt off his back. Wasn't necessarily seeking the spotlight kind of a thing. So there were a lot of common threads with these people I interviewed throughout the years. It's funny, when you told me that little story about Brad Delp, how he would always sign everybody's autograph, there's a little story in the book. I interviewed a couple of rock photographers who toured with the Cars and would go on tours with them and, shoot concerts. And he told me a story, I think it was the only one from him that I ended up putting in the book, that they were on tour in Texas, I believe Houston, and it was an off day, and him and Ben went to a mall to do some shopping. And they're walking around in the mall, and somebody noticed Ben and went up to Ben and asked for an autograph. And then all of a sudden, people started gathering around. And the next thing you know, he said there was like 50 people around him. And he said, I never forgot this. He goes, Ben stood there, and we must have stood there for an hour until every autograph was signed. He was very appreciative of his fans. And he stood right there and took pictures and answered questions and signed autographs. And he said, we ended up being there for an hour before they left. He made sure that he signed every autograph and thanked every fan that had. So it just reminded me of that story when you told me about Brad.
Well, and think about this in the time we are now, it's 2020. When an artist signs every autograph like that and takes the time, he's remembered forever by all those people he touched. And if you're arrogant and don't sign the autograph, they remember that.
They remember the good and the bad, you're right.
And it can sour them even wanting to hear your records. And so he did the whole band a favor because they'll never forget meeting Ben, and then he's gone. I knew him. I met him.
Right.
You know?
He signed my autograph.
Well,
me and 50 other people that were standing there. Yeah.
Very, very important. And, you know, that Greg will come out and do a TV show and contribute. So do you know Andy Pratt?
Andy Pratt's in the book.
Okay, good.
I know Andy.
Angus
Oh.
Studios is where the Milkwood album was cut.
Yep. Talk about it in the book, too. Yep.
Now, do you mention who the A&R man was at Paramount?
A&R man at Paramount.
Who signed the cars? Do you know? I mean, well, Milkwood, which was Milkwood was Rick and Ben, Rick Otkasik, Ben Orzechowski, and then on maybe horn or something different was Greg Hawkes.
Yeah, Greg did play on the Milkwood album. You know, I don't delve a lot into the Milkwood part of their story.
The late Russ Reagan was involved with he was with 20th Century in Motown. I knew Russ. He just passed. I mean, all these legends I knew and hung out with, they're gone.
I think I do mention the name who originally signed them. It's not coming to me at the moment. But what I was going to say was, not that the Milkwood part of their story isn't important, but it was hard to find a lot of information about it, you know, because Milkwood was pretty brief before they turned into Captain Swing.
I tried to get Milkwood on Universal Music. So you want to hear the story? It's interesting. 1986 CDs came out.
Right.
So we're dealing with Irving Azoff because I represented Jimmy Miller, Stone's producer, and Kate Hyman I knew well. So I wrote Kate Hyman and Irving a proposal to start the Universal Silver Line CD series. The Cars Milkwood, Elton John B-sides, Mitch Ryder in Detroit. And I talked to Mitch Ryder about this, right? I get a letter from Andy McKay. Joe, we love your ideas. I'm now in charge. He just took my ideas, right? And he says, we're not going to, the Joe Perry project.
Really?
Because it was all on MCA, and they had these, but CDs had just come into vogue. He said, you got to have this classic Silver Line series. It'll sell a ton. Well, the Mitch Ryder thing sold a ton. And Andy McKay wrote me, and he says, we're going to put out the Mitch Ryder record. It became a big collectible on CD. And I said, you got to add Gimme Shelter, because they did Gimme Shelter as a B-side, and it's on the CD. Very rare CD if you can find it now, but I instigated it. It's pretty funny.
Wow.
But I wanted Milkwood out, and it would, how many records? It would have sold easily 100,000. It was in the heyday.
Oh, yeah. In the Cars' heyday, that definitely would have been a seller.
But Irving got like $250 million to go create giant records for Warner Brothers. Kate went to Imago Records, so the two people I'm dealing with are gone.
Wow.
And Andy took over, and Andy just basically retired maybe a year or two ago. So all that time, for 30 years, he was in control of the Universal catalog. But Kate said to me, boy, you know more about our back catalog than we do. Because I was given the catalog numbers and said, we got to do this, we got to do that.
Andy Pratt's a great guy.
Andy.
He's interviewed in the book.
Paul, our director, saw Andy on June 1 of last year, 2019. And Andy played with me again on New Year's Eve at the Cantab.
Wow.
Downstairs. So Andy was amazing. Again, the band was ragtag thrown together. It was fun. And Andy just still shimmered and shined.
Yeah.
You know, he knew how to control it. And the band, it was like a good friend of mine from the Joe Perry project playing drums for Andy. June 1. And he goes, Joe, thanks.
Joe Pett?
No. Mark Bell.
Mark Bell. I've talked to Mark. Mark's in the book, too. We keep mentioning all these names, and they're all
Mark's
in there.
got a book out.
Yeah, I know. I was just on a radio show with him a couple of weeks ago.
What radio show? See, we're having fun, people. This is just this is a fun show because it's just all the fun people we know are all in the book.
Well, he was a guest on the show, and I called in, and we ended up talking for 10 or 15 minutes on the air. Mark's a great guy. And the book is great. I don't know if you've read it or not, but I bought a copy of the book, and it's a really cool book.
I've invited him on the show, and we'll get him on the show. We're old dear friends. We go back. way back. Mark, I mean, we're digressing, but this is the fun aspect of all of this. Mark comes over to my house. He starts playing me a Joe Perry tape. They left off the MCA album, When Worlds Collide, and I'm saying, oh my God, this is incredible. But I think Aerosmith redid it years later. When they rejoined, they took the music, and I think they put out When Worlds Collide maybe under a different name.
They must have changed the title then, yeah.
And maybe they changed the song, but you've heard it?
I haven't heard the song, but I've talked to Mark about it. He's mentioned the song to me.
Oh, it's amazing. He's just playing it in my kitchen. It's like, wow, this is, they left this off the record. What are they thinking?
Wow.
It's like Stevie Nicks, Silver Springs. Why leave that off an album?
Right.
The thing's a classic.
Well, sometimes I think a band will put out an album and the songs they think are going to be singles are not, and something that they didn't think is going to be a single ends up being a single. So sometimes it's hit or miss, I think.
The hit from the third Zeppelin album, Livin', Lovin', Made, that was the second album. The Immigrant Song, right?
Immigrant Song, yeah.
Flip of it's the Hey, Hey, What Can I Do?
Right, on the radio for years, wasn't even on the album, you're right.
And they flipped it over and they loved it. So the Grasshoppers are a cool thing that Ben did. What do you think of the Grasshoppers?
I'm more a classic rock kind of guy, so it was obviously a little bit before that era. But I enjoyed it, and I interviewed all the guys in the Grasshoppers I interviewed.
That's amazing.
So they all talked to me. As a matter of fact, when I went to Cleveland to do, I've done 3 book events so far. I did one in Vermont, where I live, at the local bookstore, and I wanted to do one in Cleveland, Ben's hometown. So I did one in Cleveland, and then, of course, I mentioned the one I did in Boston. When I did the one in Cleveland, I actually stayed at the house of the Grasshoppers drummer, Wayne Weston.
Nice.
So I interviewed all the guys in the band, and, of course, they all said the same things that everyone else said about Ben. Here's a good story about Ben when I talk about his loyalty. After the Cars became huge, we're talking the mid-'80s, they would go on tour, and when it was time for them to hit Cleveland to do a show, he would call up all his friends that he grew up with, all the guys in the Grasshoppers, and he would say, I'm coming into town next week, get ready. And they'd come into town and do a show. He would get them tickets to the show. He'd get them backstage passes. He'd get them limo rides from their house, give them tour shirts, took them all out to dinner, wouldn't let them spend a dime. And he didn't just do this once. Whenever the Cars went on tour, when he came into Cleveland, he just treated all his friends.
Paul, keep that shot. I'm going to put Joe on the spot. I want an autograph.
Oh, do you now?
On camera.
Well, I'd be happy to do that.
It took me months. Joe asked me for a quote on his book, and it took me months because I hate giving quotes. I mean, Genya Raven said, Joe, you got to give me a quote for the book. And it took me weeks and weeks. I like just interviewing people and then take the quote from the interview. So I apologize, but that's the way I just can't come up with a quote out of thin air. I don't know why. It's just a mental block. But I'm having fun tonight here in Wakefield. It is the second to last day of February. We're in a leap year. So today's the 28th of February, 2020. I like to date the shows and document them. Paul Norman is our director.
I do want to say, like I just wrote in there, I just wanted to thank you for, everything you've done for me, for providing testimonial quotes and providing a quote for the book and having me on this show. I really appreciate the promotion that you've given me in the book. And
I will review the book too. I will review the book. Let's take a random chapter and just ask you, False Start, what's that about?
False Start.
Chapter Call to Boston.
Oh, yeah, that was Ben and Rick. I told you that Ben's originally from Cleveland, and Rick is originally from the Baltimore area. But when he was a teenager, his family moved to Columbus, Ohio. So he lived in Ohio as a youngster too. And that's how him and Ben got together. They kind of played in some same bands in the same areas and were playing the same venues. And so they decided to form a band, and they were playing in the Ohio area, went up into Michigan, still trying to search out a record deal. So this is like a decade before the Cars came out. And they decided we have to go to New York City. That's how we're going to get a record deal. So they went to New York City, and they had no money, no nothing, just went. And they tried to get a record deal. They started playing some clubs and stuff, but it ended up being a false start because it didn't happen. So Ben said he wanted to go back to Ohio, plus his father had passed away when he was really young. So he wanted to go back and be with his mom and help her, get back on her feet and stuff. So Ben went back to Cleveland, and Rick stayed in Boston. And then he eventually talked him into coming back. So they kind of went to the East Coast to try to get it going, and it wasn't working out. So I kind of, false start, Cars. So that was kind of how that chapter started.
Well, it's interesting that Rick was a little older than the rest of us in the scene back in 76, 77. And I think that little bit of age and him being so clever really benefited him because they had the Paramount deal.
Right.
And that was a false start for them.
Mm-hmm.
Crosby, Stills, Ocasek, and Orr is what I called it.
Yep.
It was really a folky album.
It really was. Yeah, they were trying to take, that was huge at the time, that type of music. So they tried to take advantage of that. Obviously, it didn't quite work out. But yeah, that was a false start for them.
But Rick was smart enough to see the whole new wave thing, and Modern Lovers drummer, and you've got Greg Hawkes from the Martin Mull. Greg played on a Martin Mull album.
Yes, he did.
And you've got Elliot Easton, this amazing guitar player,
right,
who ended up playing Creedence tunes for most of his life.
He did.
Instead of Cars tunes, he's playing Creedence Clearwater with the rhythm section.
Mm-hmm. He's got another band now. He's in the Empty Hearts, they're called. And that's who else is in that band? Clem Burke, drummer from Blondie, is in that band. And Wally Palmer, who is an original member of the Romantics, is in that band. And they just released an album. So Elliot's still doing it.
Well, it never leaves you. If you're breathing, you're playing rock and roll.
Mm-hmm.
It just never leaves you. And does Greg still play with Todd Rundgren?
Yeah, it's funny. When I did my Boston book event, I'm not going to say I'm necessarily friends with them. I don't hang out with them, but I am Facebook friends with his wife Elaine, who is just the sweetest lady. And I contacted them when I set a date for my Boston book event, and I invited him and David, hoping that they could come to the event. And Greg ended up not being able to come because he was currently on tour with Todd. And we had a little joke on. I'm like, well, he can't just put Todd Rundgren aside and come to my book event. So that's why Greg would have been there. But yeah, I think the tour stopped now. But yeah, up until recently, he was still touring with Todd. But I can say that David Robinson was kind enough to come to my book event. So that was a thrill for me. And there were a lot of Cars fans at my event, fans who had been following my progress with this book for a long time and waiting for it to come out. And I actually had fans from all over the country fly in. And Ben's ex-wife Judith flew in from Los Angeles.
Is that where Judy is?
For my event, yep. And he had a significant other. You know, when he put out his solo album, The Lace, in the 80s, he wrote that album with a woman named Diane Page. They never got married, but it was like the longest relationship of his life. They were together for nearly a decade, and they wrote that album together. She now lives in Florida. She flew up for my event. So it was a real special night for me to have some of these important people in Ben's life take the time to fly in.
Where was the event?
Where? What's the name of the event? I mean, the venue.
In Boston?
Yeah.
That's okay.
I'm so sorry, it's escaping me at the moment.
That's I have senior moments every other minute. But the Cars just were a fun band, and they didn't have the stage moves of, say, Aerosmith. They were really a kind of a machine. And it was interesting watching them because they had this intense mechanical kind of new wave approach to stage presence.
Yeah. You know, you're right. They weren't into
Crawling through the ceiling.
stage antics, if you will, jumping around on stage. And
Mark Bell is one of the best frontmen we've had in the
yeah.
Boston scene.
Yeah, he's
Mark Bell is a real master, and
Thunder Train.
yeah, well,
Yep, that was his. I'm surprised they never. Well, I think they might have put out I don't think they got an official record deal though. I'm not sure about that.
not an official record deal, but they had the Duke and the Drivers guys, I believe, put their first record out. Duke and the Drivers were an R&B band that got on ABC Dunhill. So they were. I saw Duke open for Lou Reed, and I'm saying, what a strange pairing. But I love Duke and the Drivers, and they had a song called Love Bones. That was incredible. It was a great song. So like Canned Heat, which came out of the Boston area, Duke and the Drivers kind of were just blues fans, and they were so fanatical, they started playing the blues, and they actually became very good at it, much like Canned Heat, which was Al Wilson out of Arlington. So there's so much to the Boston music scene, and the Cars were a very big part because you get your ABCs, you know, Aerosmith, Boston, the Cars.
Right.
And D, Duke and the Drivers.
The Cars very much wanted to concentrate on the music, as opposed to just being theatrical on stage. You know what I mean? So that they, you know, sometimes they've been described as being almost cold on stage or too mechanical, but I didn't look at it that way. They just wanted to come out and play the music and concentrate on doing the best show that they could musically, and, you know, never mind with the pyrotechnics and leaping around on stage and all that kind of thing. They just came out and did their thing. Yeah.
I would have liked the Cars to have been a little more animated, but I've saw more shows than most.
Right.
I was there. I was there out in the suburbs because, again, David was dating this woman, and I was driving her around. So we were at a lot of the different shows out in the, you know, Fred Lewis was their manager, I think, at the time.
Yes, he was.
Yep.
He's one of the few gentlemen that I couldn't track down. I couldn't find him.
He was living in Carlisle.
Yep, I could not find him anywhere. He was one. There was only a handful of people that I wasn't able to connect with. Maxine Sartori was another one, WBCN DJ, who helped get the Cars. She was the first one to put Captain Swing on the radio. I tried to track her down and couldn't find her either. So there were a few people that
I could have found her for you.
that eluded. I'm sure you could have.
But don't you know who could have found her for you better than me?
Who?
John Macy. Very close friends with Maxine.
Well, but you know what though? I'm not 100% sure of that because I did talk to some people who were good friends with her, and they said, Joe, if you find her, let me know. So I think she decided to, maybe not, you know, become a recluse per se, but I think she decided to back away from the business and just not be involved in music anymore. Because I had friends of hers saying, Joe, I've been looking for her for years. I don't know where she
there's
is.
some BCN people that could have gotten you to her, but
I'm sure.
But that's okay. The book is the book. She contributed to the liner notes of the Double Cars disc on Rhino. This is a cool thing. And she called it the demo that got the deal, which is my radio show, which I had Greg on. So she must have heard Harvey Warfield doing I was the producer, I'd write the script. We had Greg on, demo that got the deal. And she kind of referenced it in the liner notes to that.
Harvey Warfield, the Rock and Roll Air Force.
Well, AAF is gone.
I know.
And he was one of the originals, the AAF here. That's funny that you know that because very few people know that.
I remember I was a freshman in high school listening to AAF, Harvey Warfield's Rock and Roll Air Force. Do you know Brett Milano?
Yeah, of course.
I think, not to try to correct you, but I think Brett wrote the liner notes
I didn't say she wrote the liner notes. I said she contributed to to Brett.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because Brett was the moderator at my Boston event. And you know what? In the back of my mind, I'm really bothered that I can't remember the venue that it was at. Maybe you can help me. It's in Beverly, and I believe 9 is in...
Oh, 9 Wallace.
9 Wallace, thank you so much. Now, while we're talking, it's still in the back of my mind
now,
going, I can't believe I can't remember it.
9
That's where my event was.
9 Wallace has some rock and roll history.
Oh, great place.
But it has some rock and roll history because there was a band called Private Lightning. You remember them?
No.
They were on A&M Records around the time of the Cars.
Private Lightning.
And it was Patty Van Ness and her brother Paul Van Ness, and their cousin Peter Van Ness runs Nine Wallace.
Peter, yep. Peter was so great to me setting up this event. Really nice. Him and his wife.
Now, how do you like for an old man knowing all these things?
You've gotten me a
That's
couple
pretty
times.
good. Huh? No, but I mean, I got bluesheimers all the time. My friend Danny Klein from Jay Giles calls it bluesheimers.
Love Danny.
Yeah.
DK.
DK. I managed him for a while.
Really?
Yeah.
I've met him a couple of times. What's the name of his current band?
Well, they do Kyle's covers, I think.
Is it Full House?
It sounds like it.
I think it might be Full House.
But with the ABCDs of Boston rock and roll, and then you got Jay Giles, ABCDJ.
Right.
Yeah, but Maxine was instrumental with Aerosmith and
Yes, she was.
in the Cars, and Charles Laquadera is still active.
Wow.
He's got a radio show, and
She helped Billy Squier, too, I believe.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah.
And Billy was in a band called the Sidewinders, and I saw them open for Aerosmith at the Frolics. So my tape of that is legendary because Billy had left the Sidewinders, and I think what was Billy Squier's band wasn't the Babies. It was another band. He had a I know what the name is. Billy Squier.
You sound like me trying to remember.
Yeah, but Billy Squier had 2 albums out, and Who's Your Boyfriend was the song. Great song by Billy Squier. Who's Your Boyfriend? What was that band? It'll come back to me, but they did 2 albums, and then Billy Squier hit big with hard rock. He went harder rock.
Yeah.
But he was pop with the Sidewinders, and their song was Rendezvous. And then he had Billy Squier put 2 more albums out with another band. And then
Well, this show's turning into a regular history of Boston rock and roll. I love it.
But that's the fun thing because now
I love it.
People will do a standard interview with you, but the subtitle of it's our 25th year. The subtitle of the show's always been digression. But that's what makes it fun. Upbeat.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, how many people know that Upbeat had the Velvet Underground, and the Velvet Underground spawned the Cars, and the backup band was Ben Orr's band? I didn't know that. So it kind of brings it all full circle that, out in Cleveland is where, the Velvet Underground went out and played.
Yeah.
And, the guy who wrote your foreword, his father taped them. And it's like, this is amazing stuff. This is the fun stuff. Because people can read the book and you've packed so much information. This reads like a professional fanzine. And that's a compliment.
Wow. I appreciate that.
You know Cinerama? The Cinefantastique. Cinefantastique is a fanzine on film, and I believe it's still around. It's been around for 40 years, but it looks like Life magazine. It is a professional fan magazine, and that's what your book is. You get into the nitty-gritty that some publishing houses don't want to get that detailed. They want, like Tommy James' book. Have you read it?
No.
It's great, and I've interviewed him multiple times, and Tommy's awesome guy, and he's got so much depth to him. He's just this amazing songwriter, producer. He's such a great producer. And he wrote this book as a kind of screenplay because they're shopping it for a movie. But all the critical details that I love about the Shondells and all the records they made are left out, which you would have gotten, because they had to make it 250 light pages where you're 255 packed pages. Your typeset is a lot smaller than the Tommy James book.
I've actually had people say, how come the type is so small? Not realizing that I don't have too much control over the way the book appears. That's all the publisher. And I had a lot of fans, especially female fans who love Ben, saying, how come these photos aren't in color? And I'm like, I tried. And they would say, because in my promotion, I talked about how almost all of the photos in that book are previously unseen, unpublished photos. I had people I would interview, they would open up their photo albums and take out photos from their own personal collections and scan them and send them to me. So except for a couple of photos in that book, they're all never-before-seen photos. And I would tell the story how I collected, I didn't count them all up, but over 300 photos I have from people's collections. And they're like, how come there's only, I think there's 35 maybe in there? How come there's not more photos? Where are the rest of the photos? And I don't decide that. The publisher came to me and said, Joe, we love all your photos. And that was actually one of the selling points of getting the publisher to take my book. They loved the fact that I had all these unpublished photos.
Yeah. Publishers
We love them all,
photos.
Joe, but you can only pick out 35. 35 out of 300? How am I going to do that? It was hard to do. That was almost as hard as writing the book, trying to pick out the photos that I wanted to put in there. But I tried to spread it out. I mean, there's pictures in there. Another thing, when we talk about Ben's musicianship, of course, pretty much everyone just knows him as a bass player, because that's what he was with the Cars. Ben was a multi-instrumentalist. The first band he was ever in Cleveland, they were called the Cyclones. He was 13 years old, and he was a drummer. His parents gave him drum lessons when he was 10 years old. So the first band he was ever in was a drummer. And the guys in the band were older than him, and they had to sneak him in the back door into these bars to play. And they had to convince his parents, a 13-year-old kid going to a bar in downtown Cleveland, are you kidding me? So they used to sneak Ben in the back door so he could be the drummer. When he auditioned for the Grasshoppers, he became the rhythm guitarist and the lead singer. So I interviewed some people in Cleveland who knew him when he was, in his teens in the Grasshoppers, and they said when the Cars came out, they were amazed that they saw Ben playing bass because they knew him as a guitar player when he was younger. And then when it came time to be in the Cars, they didn't have a bass player, so he adapted his skills once again and became a bass player. His first wife told me that she thinks that you give Ben an instrument and let him go play with it for a couple hours and he'll figure it out. I think he's kind of underrated in that regard because people just know him as the sit-in-the-pocket bass player for the Cars, not a virtuoso. The man could play anything. And, of course, I've already talked about his voice.
Bobby Hebb, Sonny, one of the greatest musicians on the planet. And people just heard Sonny. They didn't know that he did so many sessions and he could play anything and was one of the most musical guys around. He was from Rockport. David Robinson rented a storefront and Bobby lived on top of it, in Rockport. Do you know David has a store in Rockport? Or
yes. The day that I did my, my book event in Boston, we went out to his shop to see if he was there. Of course, it's right on the water, beautiful area. We go there, it's closed. He kind of keeps his own hours. So we walked around for a while.
What was it? What kind of shop?
He's an artist. He creates custom jewelry. That's what he does now. Because, of course, when he was with the Cars, he designed all their album covers. So he's always been an artist. But that's what he does now. He designs custom jewelry. So,
who's the famous guy? Vargas?
Yeah, Vargas did, Alberto Vargas.
And it was David's idea.
Yes, David actually shot the model on the car and gave him the photo, and then he created, because David was really into pinup art. And he was a world-famous guy. He didn't even know who the Cars was. As a matter of fact, the gentleman was in his 80s, and he had already retired. And his granddaughter loved the Cars, and she talked her grandfather into coming out of retirement to create that Let's Go Candy-O cover, the Candy-O cover.
So that's how the genesis of that.
Yeah. So to finish that story, we went to try to see David at his shop. It was closed. We walked around, did a little shopping for an hour or so. We came back, and he was there. The shop was open, but he was sitting, there was like a porch there, and he was sitting on the porch in a chair. I walked up, introduced myself. He brought us into his shop. We must have chatted for an hour. And the whole time I'm thinking, is David going to come to my event tonight? Because I sent him an official invitation. Is David going to come to my event tonight? And I wasn't going to ask him, though. I just, he knew that it was going on.
Rockport's not too far from Beverly.
No. Well, when we were getting ready to leave, he said, hey, we'll see you tonight.
What year was that?
What?
That you had the signing 2 years ago?
No, the event was just about a year ago now. The book's been out November. November was a year. So it's been out for a year and 3 months.
We lost Bobby in 2010. 10 years ago. I can't believe that. But Bobby lived upstairs from David Robinson.
Oh, really?
The guy who wrote Sonny.
Wow.
Dear friend of mine. He took me to dinner in Rockport, and I'm walking down the street with him, and everyone's like, "Hi, Bobby. Hi, Bobby." I'm like, he's the mayor of Rockport. I mean, this great guy that toured with the Beatles, their final tour. Bobby was on the tour. This is all, the cars touched, but they're traveling in these circles. You got two rock stars in one unit in Rockport.
So funny. That's so funny. I can't say enough good things about David.
Oh, David's a sweetheart.
His
brother's a dear friend of mine, Paul.
Yeah, Paul's a good guy.
Did Paul talk to you?
I haven't met him personally, but I'm connected with him on Facebook.
Did you talk to him on the phone about the book at all?
To David?
No, the brother.
No, I didn't interview him
because the brother would have a ton of.
Yeah, I know. But that goes back to me saying I could have interviewed 10 billion people for this book. But I can't say enough good things about David. When he agreed to interview with me, we had like 3 different phone conversations, and each one lasted at least an hour. And it's funny, in the middle of the conversation, he'd go, "Oh, by the way, this one's off the record," and he would tell me a story, and then he goes, "Okay, we're back on the record again." And so I had to pick through everything because I recorded the interviews obviously, so I could go back and transcribe them. But he would let me know when something was on the record and off the record. But he had nothing but great things to say about Ben, and he told me some really great stories, and a lot of them are in the book.
We got 7 minutes left. I'm going to throw a wow one at you. Could you say this is Joe Milliken, author of Let's Go on WCAT?
Can I say it?
Yeah.
Why not?
We want a station ID. We'll do it right now.
This is Joe Milliken, and we're on WCAT talking about my book, Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars.
In Wakefield, Massachusetts. See, that was cool. Just make it part of the show, right?
Well, thank you.
So we do the demo that got the deal. We did it with Greg Hawkes. And I got to think of a fancy title for the pitch that got the book deal. What was the pitch that got you the deal with the publishers? Littlefield.
Roman and Littlefield. Well, I've been a published writer for 20 years as a music journalist. But it's all been newspapers and magazines. This is my first book. And as you can imagine, a book is a totally different animal. And I really didn't know anything about it. I'd just been working on my manuscript for years, and when the time came to try to shop it around, that's what I would do. So I found a person up in Vermont. She called herself, her title was a self-publishing consultant. So I hired her to help me go through the process. And she said, "Joe, I got to tell you right now, I work with a lot of authors who don't get a publisher, and they end up having to self-publish their book. So don't be surprised or disappointed if you have to self-publish your book." So while she was helping me figure out to try to find a publisher, she was also helping me create ideas in case I had to self-publish it. So there were 2 things I was looking at as I was trying to figure this out. And being green, as I was, I thought that you could just contact a publisher and say, here's what I've written. I'm going to attach it to an email and take a look at it. Doesn't work out that way. You have to send them a pitch letter first, tell them what your book is about, and then they will request a proposal. It took me 2 months to write the proposal because just as important as what is in the book, you have to prove to them that you know what your audience is, and you have to prove to them that you're going to sell books, because why are they going to take you on board if you're not going to sell books? So I went through this 2-month process of creating the proposal, and they ended up taking my book. My rep told me the main reasons were, I already told you one, the unpublished photographs. And the other one is, they said, without even reading the book, when you told us that you spent a decade putting this together and you interviewed 120 people, that tells us right there that you put your heart and soul into this thing, and you weren't just trying to put a book together and try to get something out there, that you really worked hard on it. And the other part of it was, I knew what my audience was. I already had a Facebook page. I had Cars fans contacting me saying, "When's the book coming out? I heard you're doing this book." And I created a mailing list. And I said, "The book's not ready yet. Give me your name and your email. I'll put you on my mailing list. When the book comes out, I'll let you know." So I started collecting all these names over the years. And I had hundreds of names of fans. So I pretty much said, when this book comes out, all of these people are already going to buy it. So they knew that I did the research. They knew that I knew what my audience was or where I could find them. They saw that I had a Facebook that already had pushing 1,000 likes on it. So they knew that I was already establishing an audience, and there were already Cars fans who knew about this book. And that was another piece of why they took me on.
Now, do you know about the Book Expo America?
I do.
May 29th.
I've heard, yeah, a couple of people have mentioned that to me.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So are they going to have a table there?
Roman and Littlefield does have a table there, I believe.
It's worth you going over there.
Yeah, I've
Even
heard
for
that.
one day. I went for one day. I walked out with like 3 bags of books, and I should have got a hotel room. They give away galleys.
Right.
So is there a galley on this? Did you get a galley in advance?
I did.
So that's a collector's item.
I have 2 copies of it.
They were throwing away, it was breaking my heart. I was there like the last day, they're throwing away galleys, like thousands. I'm like, no, this is like a rarity. And it's like, I took as much as I could home. But the Book Expo, I met Dr. Ruth. I got a picture with her.
Wow.
It's fun, and it's got like every publisher around the world. Not every, but a majority of them.
Yeah,
And
a lot
it's
of
at
major
the
publishers.
Javits Center. So that is really worth going to New York and hitting all of the places you can, the media and whatever. You could do it all right there because they're all there.
Yeah.
I might go. You should go.
I've been told that more than once.
Yeah, because it is the place. We only have 1:52 left. I'm going to ask you to say this is Joe Milliken on Visual Radio.
This is Joe Milliken on Visual Radio, talking about my book, Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars.
We just gently slide the station IDs in. Do you enjoy the station at Wakefield?
Oh, yeah, this place is beautiful. I had to remind myself that it was in a high school. This is a very professional setting, and everyone's been wonderful.
Well, 20 years ago, I used to do the VHS tape editing right here. And I'm happy they turned this into a studio. So this is the B studio, but we enjoy taping them here. And I'm so happy you drove all the way down. Thank you.
Oh, I can't thank you enough for having me on board. Like I said, I know that we've known each other a long time, and I interviewed you for the book way back when. But it's nice to finally get together with you and meet you face to face, and I can't thank you enough for having me on board. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a great time.
Craig Fenton, Jefferson Airplane biographer, Jefferson Starship, drove up from New Jersey to be on the show, and we're dear friends now.
Wow.
I had him write the liner notes to the Marty Ballin movie I did. It's Visual Radio, February 28th. We want to thank Paul Norman, our director. We want to thank Ryan, Ian, Barbara, the whole staff and crew here at WCAT Wakefield. Have a safe drive home. Thanks again. This is Visual Radio with talking about one of our favorite subjects, the cars and music and Boston music. And we'll be building websites. We're going to be on a ton of radio stations, Cambridge, Woburn, Stoneham, all over the place. 8 seconds. Hey, and so thank you again.
Thanks, Joe. It's been a great time.